Bonjour à tous, nous sommes toujours à Rio de Janeiro, le G20 vient de se terminer et nous avons l'honneur aujourd'hui d'avoir Tings Chak qui est chercheuse à la Tricontinental pour la recherche sociale, entre autres spécialisée en sciences politiques, en géopolitique. Elle est née à Hong Kong, elle vit à Beijing, elle parle de très nombreuses langues et elle vient de sortir un très très long article justement de recherche sur la relation brésilienne-chinoise, la relation stratégique brésilienne-chinoise, tous les deux membres importants des BRICS, les 5 premiers pays fondateurs du groupe des BRICS. Et on sait très peu de choses en France, en fait, plutôt parce qu'on ne fait pas l'effort, sur cette relation sino-brésilienne qui est très très importante en géopolitique et spécifiquement dans les BRICS. So, hello, Tings Chak. Thank you very much to be with us here for Fréquence Populaire. Si vous aimez ce que l'on fait, n'oubliez pas de liker, de commenter, de partager et bien sûr, si vous pouvez, vous avez un lien pour nous aider à faire ce que nous faisons. So once again, welcome. So you just wrote an article, a very, very long article, very interesting, a lot of information on the Chinese-Brazilian relations. It's very important, yeah. It's 50 years of this strategic relation, and it doesn't depend on the president. It looks like with Bolsonaro, it works as well as with Lula. What you can say to us about this relation? Why is it so important for Brazil and China?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's great to meet here in Rio, in a beautiful city like this, to talk about geopolitical questions of our times. So I think one of the things is, of course, a lot of attention is on this Brazil and China's leadership, particularly in the BRICS formation, but also as major countries of the global south. Just today, the presidents Lula and Xi Jinping are meeting in Brasilia, a very important meeting, not only to celebrate this 50 years of diplomatic relationships that the countries have established, but also looking at what are some of the plans for the bilateral relationships, but also for the future, including questions about BRICS, but including about a strategic development for both countries. Well, why I wanted to write this article is to help us remember that the relationship doesn't start in when established relations are formed formally. But we actually have a long history as countries, I think, we used to call them third world countries, or countries of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, emerging from colonialism and imperialism. Today we call them the global south countries in formations like BRICS. So both these countries have a long history that extends well before 1974. And so I tried to map these 7 decades of friendship and relationship between the countries from a political standpoint, from economic, as well as cultural, the people-to-people ties, which is a very important part. I think a part that's often missed in the discussions more around the trade and economic questions only.
So it's very interesting because your article starts with a song, with the words of a song, a Brazilian song, and it was played for Lula when he visited China last year. And the song is Novo Tempo, a new era. It's very interesting. Is it a way to say that a new era in the international relation is starting with the BRICS, or especially with this Chinese-Brazilian relation, that the world of the unilateralism of the United States is ending?
I think that's definitely one of the readings. I mean, Brazil and China form a really important part, being large nations from the global south that have been pushing this geopolitical tectonic shift that we have been seeing in the last years, where there's been a clear decline of the hegemony of the United States, or the US-led West, the imperialist bloc, let's call it. And so in that sense, I think it is signaling, but it's also signaling around the next 50 years. What does the next 50 years look like in this relationship between the two countries? Actually, to add to this, the new era, today, as I just mentioned, the two presidents are meeting, and she was welcomed also in a very, very grand procession with actually horses accompanying his car. And one of the things that Xi said in his speech today was that this is the best historic moment between the relationships between Brazil and China. So I think there has been a lot of emphasis placed on where I think the key word has been synergy is being found between Brazil and China. One of the things we've seen, talking about the geopolitical shifts, is Brazil and China have been really in tune on the question of Ukraine in terms of trying to propose together a solution to the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine. Especially, Celso Marin, which is the highest diplomat of Brazil, went to China to discuss with the foreign minister of China, Wang Yi, earlier this year to discuss what is this path. And so they've been putting together those 6 points of a path to peace and different things like that. So I think there are some alignments on the geopolitical questions, as well as building infrastructure like BRICS, which is, we have to remember, is still a very young attempt from a Global South initiative. To think about economic and political alternatives where our countries can actually find a path towards development and national sovereignty. I mentioned, our history begins in this struggle of third world countries for independence. That national liberation struggle hasn't ended, for so many other countries.
Between the BRICS, yeah? Within
Absolutely.
The BRICS. This past, this neo-colonial past, having been under the rule of the West in the 19th, 18th, 17th, for some countries, even 20th century. So it's even the Russians, because I have the feeling that they have been betrayed in the 90s. They wanted to be with the West, even with NATO, for a long time, but I have the feeling to have been betrayed. So this is a strong link, yeah?
Absolutely a strong link. I mean, what has happened even after the formal independence movement, of course in Latin America happened much earlier than in Africa and Asia, is that there was a neoliberal consensus that was imposed on our countries that essentially said that we can't have any kind of semblance of a national sovereignty because we don't have economic sovereignty, we don't have military sovereignty, we don't have all the aspects that we would require to actually develop. So there's been an underdevelopment that has continued in Latin America. They like to use the word dependency a lot from the history of the dependency theorists, but I think in many ways this is a new era for Global South countries that are meeting again when they have more economic strength, they have more, I think, some kinds of unity on some aspects. Let's not over-exaggerate some of the differences as well. There's very different political systems. The countries that form BRIC today, you have from monarchies to socialist countries to liberal democracies. It's quite a mixture. So we don't have, it's not let's say, an ideological unified bloc or front of any sort. Very different from what we would say a G7 that we can say has economic, political, militarily, ideological unity completely. It's an imperialist bloc. Anyway.
That's very, very interesting what you're saying, because there is a strange feeling in the West that's the reverse, that the Western countries, they're free, you have the freedom of the state, but all these countries within the BRICS, that's dictatorship. Of course, there is a logical problem with Brazil, for example, or South Africa, or even Russia, India. So, but they have this feeling, and you say it's the contrary. It's here within the BRICS that's more diverse in skin color, in political regimes, in economy, and that they try to have a way to work together with more equality and respect of sovereignty. When the West is in fact a bloc behind the United States and very, very assume the same positions.
We've seen that even clearer, and I think it's clear to Global South countries, specifically on two different moments, on the question of Ukraine and in Palestine, that absolute unity, unquestioning unity amongst the G7 nations or the US-led West. That's not that's becoming much more clear, I think, for even Global South countries that haven't actually aligned with that agenda so clearly. So that's, I think, an interesting break from that, say, world, US rules-based order or US hegemony, because I think politically and economically, that strength has really declined in the last decades, even though militarily has still maintained its absolute hegemony. We don't have a question about that. But as I think we're going to see much more in the near coming years, the use of force increasingly so, especially for countries that are trying to find another alternative pathway for development and for pursuing the sovereignty that we're talking about.
Do you think that maybe a risk of war, well, you're speaking of a new, in your article, of a new Cold War that is coming. Do you fear a real war, especially between the United States and China? I'm asking you that because a few days ago, President Xi Jinping met the vanishing American President Joe Biden in Lima for the Asia-Pacific Summit. And he said, don't fall in the two-sided trap. And we have 4 red lines, and well, it's Taiwan, and stop mixing with us in our internal affairs, stop trying to change the regimes. It was quite a harsh talk for a Chinese president. Usually Xi Jinping and the Chinese are more respecting protocol and trying not to be too punchy with in the words. So you think that maybe a war, really?
I mean, I think, of course, there's lots of speculation, and of course, no one wants to see. That would be really a world war, and it'd be disastrous for many people in the world. But one of the things is that in the toolbox that the U.S. has in its, let's call that hybrid warfare toolbox, it has already used a lot of those elements. I mean, we're not in a hot war in this particular moment, but we are seeing increasing encirclement, military encirclement by the U.S., you know, new bases in the Philippines to, you know, a variety of new kinds of formations around the Indo-Pacific, as they call it. But also in other factors, you know, sanctions, the amounts of unilateral sanctions. Right now, a quarter of the world's countries and a third of the world's population are suffering from unilateral sanctions from the U.S., you know, economic to a variety of, you know, business sanctions, and that's what's being threatened more and more. It didn't actually improve under the Democrats. It started, of course, with Trump in terms of the trade war, but it's only increased, and it's only going to increase now with Trump returning to power. Media warfare, that's already been, you know, so I think in many ways there's already a warfare that is happening. Of course, we don't want to see it escalate into a hot war. So one of the things I think we're anticipating now with Trump's return is that I think China has become more prepared to defend itself in different ways, you know, because the first Trump, I know we weren't talking about the U.S. elections directly, the first Trump did take China by surprise by some of the force of these economic sanctions. So, and it helped in a way take away some of the illusions around what the U.S. is really about. Because for many decades, around the opening up
reform. A little bit like for Russia.
I think in some ways it is. So in this time, I think China's more prepared in terms of, well, one of the strategic ways is to build more alliances with other global south and friendly countries. And try to sort of, it wouldn't use the word de-link, but anyways, make the internal supply chains more resilient, resistant, try to build up the domestic consumption so that, you know, that can really, that what we call dual circulation in China, as well as I think we can't underestimate the role of these multilateral global south-led institutions that are coming about.
When in the West, even among geopolitical analysts, they look at the BRICS. Well, for many years, it was, well, the last years, it was like, oh, this is nothing. It's just drinking tea, and it's without consequences because they are so different. There is the war, kind of war between India and China, and now I think they're taking more seriously. But they have a view, maybe that, well, it's led by Russia, it's led by China. These are evil countries. China, well, Russia wants to invade all Europe. It's not clear with which army, but okay. And China, of course,
wants to take over the world too.
Over the world, yeah. And we see them. We see they're vicious. It's a bit of a caricature, but there is a lot of that. And they try to remove Brazil and India from this group of evil people, because, well, they're democracies, as they consider democracy should be, but it looks like they don't know that there is such a strong link between a country like Brazil and China, and that's Brazil is a free country. It has its own interest. Is it still, in your eyes, is it still a neo-colonial way of seeing these countries?
I mean, I think definitely, I think that perception, what you're saying, is not far from the truth at all, because these are kind of caricatures that have a long history, you know, around how people view Russia, how people view China, or also how people view global South countries trying to assert a sort of project for themselves is seen as with disdain, or just like look at the, you know, they'll never get it done, you know, because they can't get it together, right? That same colonial attitude. But I think we can't also underestimate the viciousness of imperialism, you know? Like Biden famously said that no, Latin America, you're not our backyard, you're our front yard, you know, like that makes a difference. Remember, that was, I think, a couple of years ago. But that's the mentality that always has been since Monroe Doctrine was established 200 years ago in the Americas. And that's part of the reason why I also want to look, in this article, look at the history, especially because this year, 60 years since the 1964 coup in Brazil that deposed Goulart, or Jango, as he's more popularly known here. And that's that coup 60 years ago led into a 21-year military dictatorship. We know very well in the Americas that was the response. So a lot of the popularly elected and progressive and leftist governments around Latin America were responded to by all kinds of regime change and coups. That's the sad history of the 20th century for Latin America.
Yes.
But what was interesting...
All the Condor operations.
Absolutely, right? Because they already had Cuba, they could not risk another kind of socialist project, what they did with Allende.
Argentina, Chile.
Absolutely.
People know more about Chile, but it's Argentina, Bolivia, and so on and so forth.
So Jango was by far, he's not a socialist, you know, but he was a progressive leftist. He worked with a lot of the different trade unions, progressive forces in the country. And he was, interestingly, in 1961, he visited China. He was the first high-level, he was the vice president at the time, first high-level leader to visit China. Remember, China, after the revolution, was completely sanctioned on the diplomatic stage. You know, even a decade after its establishment, a couple dozen countries had diplomatic relations. Only in the Americas was only Cuba after 1959. So for a leader like Jango to go visit China was a high, you know, statement. Of course, the U.S. is not going to ignore what that meant, and there was a lot of anti-communist, anti-Chinese rhetoric. It was on the front page of the New York Times. There was a lot of that red fear that was being created. But what was his perspective? His perspective wasn't that he wanted a socialism for Brazil. He was proposing a development agenda that he thought, okay, so one of the big things he led a trade delegation to talk about was around agricultural exports. That one of the main discussions was like that Brazil, as being a big agriculture producer until today, still is fixed in these unfavorable conditions around exporting commodities at prices set, you know, in New York, you know. It doesn't make any sense. This is the case for so many of our countries in the global South. So that conversation 60 years ago was what, you know, Jango was taking to China and saying, oh, we're open to having trade relations with socialist countries. We're open to having trade relations with any friendly countries. Well, we fast forward 60 years ago, that's not that different from what a BRICS or, you know, global South countries are trying to do. But what happened? Jango was violently deposed in a military civil coup with, you know, the blessings and the support of the United States for 21 years into the dictatorship. So we aren't also naive. We're not saying we're living in the same moment, but we're also not naive that imperialism will just let and sit idly by while global South countries find another path forward. History teaches many things, and actually we have to learn from that to be a bit smarter as well.
There was such an attempt during Bolsonaro's time, and we heard in the morning of the second day of the G20 that overshadowed also the G20 that there was an assassination attempt, organized plan 1 year ago against Lula. So is it still there for Brazil that the USA is willing by coups or controlling governments to avoid this strong relation?
I mean, I think Lula himself, without, of course, the revelation of the assassination plan was quite shocking, Actually, talking about Django, there was a plan also revealed that upon his visit returning from China, that his plane would be shot down. It didn't happen. So there's these striking parallels. But one of the things is that, Lula has been very vocal on, maintaining relations with many, many different countries, and for that he suffered a lot of attacks from the mainstream, mostly right-wing controlled media about he's trying to bring communism, China's a dictatorship, he's trying to turn Brazil into dictatorship. Same old story, nothing new. But he's also experienced different forms of, maybe now it's not the same as the military taking over in the same exact way as it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But he was a product of suffered from lawfare. He spent over 500 days in prison in an orchestrated lawfare to keep him from running for presidency. That was, now we know a lot about that story and how it was very well supported by people in New York, from DC to Miami and other sorts. So that kind of action still happened, might be in different forms. Lawfare is consistently being used in many countries around Latin America, recently against Kirchner as well, in Argentina, amongst other countries. So it might take a different form, but yes, empire is still very strong in this region.
As a researcher, how do you see the reaction of the people in the West? Because it looks like that people don't know what you're speaking about. There's all this coup, and that's everybody looks like forgetting that the United States are made a lot of not only wars but assassination, coups. In Latin America, it was completely crazy after World War II. Indonesia, far Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Well, the coup against Mossadegh in '53 in Iran, and so on and so forth. It will take a long time to remind them all, but it's like they're not guilty. It's really democracy. They're very kind with everybody, and the Chinese and the others are the guilty one. But it's hard to remember any. Well, every country is doing assassination and dirty stuff. That's the way of it. But China's not so much, apparently. Yeah. Or.
I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think this is why programs like this are important, because one of the areas that by far the U.S. has absolute control over is the media landscape, the narratives. And that's why this amnesia can it seems like it's a magical pill that everyone just forgets. That, and if we talk about these kinds of coups and things, it's kind of a conspiracy theorist world. It's like, no, this is the history of the last century. This is history of our countries. I mean, this is something that I think is lived and remembered very clearly. And I think in moments like this, especially on question, I think, of Palestine, why there's been so much unanimity between global South countries, is because what the Palestinian people are facing today, a genocide, and they're preventing them from even existing as a people, as a nation, is something that's very, very resonant to a lot of our experiences of the coups, the assassinations, the regime changes, the wars, the kind of millions and millions of people that have been killed in the process of maintaining a US-led hegemony in this world. So that's not easily forgotten by the people, even if the West has selective memory, and wants to say, oh, now the biggest military threat in the world are Russia and China, Meanwhile, the U.S. is has 800 military bases around the world. I mean, this is you don't need the facts when you control the narrative anyway. So one of the things we published actually in Tricontinental Institute, where I work for, early this year, is a study called Hyper-imperialism. So it's one of our, what we're calling a new and decadent stage of imperialism, is looking at this correlation of forces from an economic, political, and military being a really important aspect to understand what we mean by imperialism today. Not get confused by there are multiple imperialisms. There's Russian imperialism, there's Chinese imperialism, there's even Brazilian and South African sub-imperialism. Many people call BRICS, an alliance of sub-imperialism. To have a clarity around that, and I think with that we need actual numbers, we need quantitative data, we need to actually know where is the military funding, how much is it, where are the bases, to be able to make those kinds of assessments. Otherwise, we get lost, I think, in these narratives of this imperialism, that imperialism, many, competing imperialist powers.
People in Europe, for example, the simple citizens, they're lost because media control and because everything is the same. Yeah, Russian imperialism is the same as the American, as the Chinese, as the Brazilian. So it's the repetition of this fake information that is making the kind of consent in the West.
I think it's a big part of it. Yeah, I think it is a big part of it. But of course, I don't live there, so I can't read the minds of people in the West. And certainly,
no, I'm asking you because you do research on that, and for me, it's always like, as you said, it's like the people are taking a magic pill and they forgot, because everything, as Noam Chomsky said once, they asked him, where do you know all these things? What are the books you're reading? He said, well, everything is written on the page 27 of the New York Times. They're just little, but you have to just remember them. Yeah. But for example, the coup in Chile a few years ago, there was a release of the CIA file saying, yeah, we organized it with the far right in Chile. And it was on the front paper, not page 27 in French media. And people, oh my God. And then, magic pill, and it's gone. For me, it's still a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, even writing this article, looking back, I used a lot of sources from the CIA. I went back to look at a lot of the coverage of the New York Times at the time. It's there. It's on the front page.
There, yeah.
And sometimes on the page 27, but it's there. And so there's a kind of moving with impunity that the U.S. acts. Even publishes. It's yes, this is what we did, and this is likely what we will do again.
Okay, it's very funny. And by the way, this imperialism came back during the G20 with the Prime Minister K.R. Steimer. 3 days after Xi Jinping said, stop mixing with us, stop speaking about human rights and your stuff, stop trying to organize war with Taiwan. These are 4 red lines, and 3 days after, when the medias were there, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Great Britain, looking at Xi Jinping, saying, "Oh, we are very concerned about problems that people have in Hong Kong regarding human rights."
Yeah, I think he cited Jimmy Lai, who used to be, he's in jail now, who ran a kind of right-wing media. But anyway, yes. But it's also interesting that these things get picked on, those questions. It's almost...
They did it again.
Yeah.
Just after... See, it's not a small country, it's China.
Yeah.
It's a huge country, and say, stop it now.
Yeah. It's also the pettiness. I think that to point to these kinds of things, the pettiness, it's like, what are you actually proposing, putting on the table? Is that all you have? Again, human rights, China. It seems... Anyway, it says a lot around maybe a lack of, strong leadership from a lot of the countries that, I don't know, especially in the West.
Well, and at the same time, he's not seeing what's happening in Gaza, which is very obvious. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What will be the reaction of China after these? What Keir Starmer said, or it's already, because you cannot say in Lima, stop doing it, or we will retaliate somehow, and then let it say during the G20 when all the cameras are fixed on them.
I mean, I think, there's Chinese patience and there's Chinese ways of doing diplomacy. I mean, I think these things are not unnoted, but I think at least the Chinese public and even the government itself, I imagine, isn't fazed by some of these things. I think there's like we were just saying earlier, there was a kind of lifting of any illusions that might have existed around, okay, this sort of friendly coexistence in the sense of, the U.S. is going to be a good friend and ally. They really have, that veil has been taken back a lot. Not only with the kind of trade war that began with Trump that I mentioned, but Taiwan has been a big aspect. It was under the Democrats where, Nancy Pelosi led a Democratic delegation to land in Taiwan, which is a complete violation of the bilateral agreements and the international agreements on, the one China policy. So these have been, time and time again, levels of aggressions that are clearly led by the US. But I think most of the time, I mean, China's quite measured in its responses. There is a sort of level of patience, but these things are also noted too. And I think that's why more and more we are seeing, and we see this in President Xi's speeches, consistently reinforcing the idea of global South development, modernization, and how to really create a new world order in which, you know, some of these things, historical imbalances get, you know, balanced out a little bit. So,
what do you think of Donald Trump election? Because, well, in the end of January, he will be in charge completely, and really in charge because he has the House and the Senate, so full control. He can do whatever he wants, and he dislikes strongly China, and he's one of the not warmonger, but he wants to contain China. So, you think that there will be problems or more?
I mean, one of the things I mentioned briefly is that, you know, if Trump won, caught China by surprise in some ways around, you know, most of the industries were not prepared for, you know, cutting so quickly from whether it's supplies from the U.S., whether it's in the sector of chips. You know, one aspect we saw strongly was Huawei, which is a, you know, Chinese big tech company, and really had hit deeply, at least the cell phone market internationally. But what did that actually do? That actually pushed companies like Huawei, just not a state-owned company, it's a private company, which very interesting structure we don't have time to get into today, to innovate and to say, okay, these are the component parts. I don't remember the numbers now, but it's hundreds of parts in a cell phone that used to have sources of technology or materials from the United States, had to say, okay, how are we going to replace these? So it actually forced China to develop, and Huawei in that example, to develop a certain resiliency and sort of cut off the sources from the US. And what did it do? Be able to launch that Huawei smartphone Mate, I think, I can't remember which number it was now, 70 I think, with the 7-nanometer chip, you know, that even surprised a lot of Chinese people how quickly they were able to develop that chip. So that's one of the maybe plus sides in a way of some of the sanctions. It forced some industries to look at where they were most weak and how to resilience and move away from US in a way that hurts the US more than it hurts China.
But that's why, sorry.
No, just to say, in terms of that, those kinds of lessons have prepared China more this time. So many of the industries have now really, Trump has been saying, oh, they'll put tariffs, they'll add this. So there's a kind of expectation on more or less what he'll do. So in that sense, I think China feels more prepared for Trump too.
But that's why we may be afraid of a real war, because what you're saying about China and the sanctions that hit China is the same in Russia. The West launched, I think it's historical, there's never such an amount of sanctions.
Like 30,000 or something, I can't remember the number now.
Russia's economy is far more weaker than Chinese economy, smaller, even if they have everything, so they can close the borders and they have everything.
Yeah.
But it's a smaller economy and they didn't succeed at all. They said we had the French Ministry of Economy, Bruno Le Maire was saying, we will put a Russian economy on knees. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not
well, actually what it did is put
it forced them, the same story, on everywhere. Agriculture, industry, chips, everywhere to do it yourself.
Yeah, and it actually forced who on the knees? It's the European economy on its knees. It forced Germany on its knees. The strategic advantage it has was the cheap Russian gas for its chemical industry, for its automobile industry, and it's basically shot itself in the foot. Now, I just read the news the other day, it's going to start soon. The huge pipeline coming down of natural gas from Russia to basically provide all of the energy needs to most of the houses in Shanghai, which is a city of 25 million plus people. So I mean, this is basically redirection. So, and who loses out on that? So anyway,
that's why propaganda doesn't work as it worked in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s for the West. But they still want. They are not anymore the supreme leader of the world, and the past, even the neo-colonial past is fading, but they still want to remain leaders of the world, especially the United States. And now economic sanctions are not working, so what remains? if you want to stay the global leader and the chief among all the others except war. So that's why some people are afraid. They use all their ammunitions, only one remains, and as you said, they're still leading from far, at least in the budgets, and a lot of military technology. So.
No, I think that's a definite fear. You know, I mean, there are now. It's not uncommon to see on the front page of, you know, mainstream Western newspapers in the U.S. to say, oh, you know, a nuclear war would be winnable. You know, these are kinds of really scary, you know, concepts that come. So I don't underestimate, you know, the militaristic nature of where this might go. So the thing is, in the meantime, what do we have to do as global South countries that actually are interested in development and peace? For most of the world, the majority of the world need to figure out, you know, get our stuff together sooner than later. And so this is where I think BRICS and other things such as Belt and Road Initiative or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and many other initiatives led and driven by global South countries need to start materializing more of the concrete proposals that can really benefit. I mean, one of the things we're still waiting on is how, you know, the new development bank will really become a possible alternative. It hasn't yet, you know, figured out, I think, where its path is in terms of being an alternative to the IMF and World Bank and these Western financial institutions that are very predatory for and against our development needs. But that takes time, so we need patience, but we're also not running out of time, but, you know, these are things that I think, big questions of our times.
Very good. I wanted your thoughts, especially on this question, because Lula had the great success now at this G20 summit, even if it was overshadowed by the authorization to fire a long rocket into the Russian territory. But he succeeded to launch this global alliance against poverty and hunger, which is something. Plus the acceptance of the idea to tax the super billionaires to get the money in order to finance this huge change, which is to stop poverty, the super poverty and the hunger. But we know that this needs financing, and it's not easy to tax super rich. And at the same time, we had this 1 month ago, the BRICS summit in Kazan, and not everything is in place, but it looks like everything is they're building all these capacities of financing through the new development bank, this way to do business through BRICS clear system, the insurance thing. In the West, they're saying no, this will never work. But are they not in fact preparing the situation that the West will not finance that, IMF will not fight against poverty, because if they wanted, they could have ended it in 30 years ago. But we will do it. So the G20 would be like a show, but in fact behind China, Brazil, Russia, all the other BRICS, they're working on their way to achieve that goal.
Yeah.
This is fantasy, what I'm saying, or
no? I think it's our big bet. You know, I don't think it's fantasy. One of the good things that came out of Kazan is the announcement that former President Dilma of Brazil will continue on in her presidency as the head of the New Development Bank, which is, I think, great for us. I think she's one of the big proponents of, you know, of not only the bank but this global South development agenda. And one of the things is, it's not a fantasy. I mean, we actually at Tricontinental, we partner with this magazine in China called Wenhua Zongheng. And our last issue, I won't ask you to pronounce it, but our last issue, what we've been trying to do is bring some of the debates from China. And I know a lot of people, because of the language barrier, have a hard time understanding what are some of the debates happening inside China. You know, of course, authoritarian countries, there's no debates, but of course we know that's not true. So we've been trying to do that, and the last issue we did was around the question of de-dollarization. It's been a buzzword, but how are many, you know, Chinese economists and thinkers thinking about this question, BRICS plays in a big question. So it was BRICS and de-dollarization. And what we did was we invited Paulo Nogueira Batista from Brazil, who used to be the vice minister of the BRICS Bank from Brazil, who's been one of the proponents and strategists around this question. So I think, anyways, I'm just doing a little promotion for that because I think there's some really interesting debates of people way smarter than me on this question. But I think back to your question about Lula announcing this, this global agenda on this food, global alliance against food and hunger is really important to note. I think China and Brazil play important roles, particularly on this question. Of course, under the hallmark campaign under Xi's presidency has been the eradication of extreme poverty. We published an essay. We actually had a chance to go down to the countryside to visit some of the projects in Guizhou, a very historically poor region in the south of China, to see how was this project done to lift the last 100 million people living in extreme poverty in China. And there's many important lessons there because it's not just about cash transfer. Many of those schemes that have been tried and tested in many countries of just giving money, a cash injection to the poor, does not resolve the questions. You have to have figure out where to get capital from the private sector and the state sector to invest in the regions that respond to the local necessities. It's about mobilizing people like people in the universities, students, governance to go to these regions, exchange. So there's a huge experience that China brings to the table on the poverty question, not only for G20, but also the BRICS countries. And Brazil as well. Remember, under Lula's first 2 terms, he was able to take Brazil off of the hunger map and lift millions of people out of poverty, extreme poverty through his various programs. But what happened after the coup against Dilma and then the right-wing governments that followed is that 33 million people in Brazil fell back into hunger in the country that's the largest agricultural producer of the world. It's a crime. It's a crime. Sure. So to bring that back on the table, I think these are important figures that have done a lot on this question that still plagues humanity and plagues most of the global south countries. So I think that's a really positive step, and coming from concrete experiences and real, I think, victories around questions of addressing hunger and the poverty issues.
There is also another topic that is discussed on a high level between China and Brazil, and that was discussed in this G20 summit, and at least at the end the final resolution was pretty good on that subject, is the renewable energy and clean energy and sustainable development. And once again, in the West, it seemed like Brazil, they're just burning the Amazon, and the Chinese, they're dirty.
Yeah, they're buying the soy that the Amazon is burned to produce.
But as a matter of fact, there is a strong advance, surprising advance. Can you tell us more about what's ongoing on this subject in China and Brazil and how they work together?
Yeah, I think it's important, some of these new agreements. I mean, actually 37 agreements were just announced today, and some of them are in this area of renewable energies. This transition to a new energy economy is a big agenda for both countries. I'll speak a little bit on the China side. I think one of the big lessons that have been learned in the last period of extreme economic growth has been that it comes at some costs to the environment. So there's been a lot of recognition of that. Restoring of the areas, the water, air, polluted areas, reforestation, and building of new forests, many things on that side. And then the second is how to actually transition. Today, I mean, China is still 50% of the energy is still from coal, but the government has made some big announcements of 2030 as the peak, and then 2060 as carbon neutral. And it's a huge thing for a country that size. But so big investments have been in the renewable energy sector. I mean, just last year, for example, China installed wind and energy capacity twice the amount of all the countries in the world combined. So China itself just did that. So there's a lot of advancements in the technology, a lot of advancements in the know-how and how to do it, and constantly doing it better, including, there's already lots of debates and questions around how to start transitioning from lithium as being the main, thing for batteries for electric vehicles, this and that. So there's also stages to come. So I think those kinds of agreements with Brazil hopefully will bear fruit, because we know that the strategic relationship between Brazil and China has to expand beyond still Brazil being a prime commodities exporter to China, and more of these strategic sectors that are also important for the reindustrialization agenda that Lula has been very strong on, and that China, I think, the experiences, technologies, and a variety of things can help, Brazil's own path to reindustrialize and develop.
Yeah, it's very interesting because in Europe, it's like they just understood that China is very far in advance in many new technologies, especially concerning electric cars and battery and new generation of battery. While in Europe, we still cannot launch logical working industry. I mean, companies are closing, so it's quite interesting that even in this topic that is considered in the West as a Western thing, Brazil and China are quite in advance.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I think it was reading an article in Financial Times where around exactly Europe is like no in order for Chinese electric vehicles to come in, we need a technology transfer now. It's like the opposite way.
40 years
right? It's something fascinating. Of course there's still the no but this is overproduction,
Yeah, sure.
It wasn't an overproduction question when China only imported European cars. That wasn't an overproduction question, but somehow when it reverses. But now, no. Okay, fine. The cars are better, way better, but we need technology transfer. So wow, that's it's hard to imagine. It's impossible to imagine, I think, 40 years ago.
No, and
20
I
years
think this
ago
article is a milestone. I mean, you cannot, after such an article in the Financial Times, you cannot anymore say, oh, we will explain you how to live, what to do, and how to do it. Shut up. There is also the ongoing war, maybe we can finish on that, in Ukraine, and this very strong and special relation between China and Brazil. You said it in the beginning. They come out with a peace resolution. I think that it's not taken seriously at all in the West, but it's a real work. It's not just something that they wrote in order to help Vladimir Putin. So what it is, how they did that, and what's the plan?
I mean, I think one of the important things, of course, you're saying that the relationship between Russia and China have probably never been this good. Now it's the limitless, strategic partnership. And today, Brazil and China announced elevation of its strategic partnership. Now, it's a very long name. I'm not going to try to say it here. But I think one of the things that's important to see the leadership of Brazil and China, especially the foreign ministries of both countries, on trying to propose and trying to negotiate. I think both countries have to, as big countries of the global south, have a responsibility to play that role. I think China is not only in the question of Ukraine, but has China stepped up to its sort of role. And we've seen that, for example, last year in the negotiation of the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is big in that region. Later on, it was huge for that region. And then earlier this year, inviting 14 different organizations from Palestine, including groups that have not been discussing, to a table to Beijing to announce the Beijing Declaration. I think these are important steps. So I think Ukraine is one of the other aspects that China and Brazil have been playing a role in trying to. Even if the West is not taking it seriously, I think those efforts have to be continued to be made.
Yeah, this peace proposition, it's also something quite crazy. We can compare it with what we said about this article in the Financial Times. Europe asking technology from China, but now it's two former colonies, poor countries, third world countries that are proposing a peace solution for a European country. I think it's shocking for many European leaders. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think surely there's probably a kind of, a former colonial mentality still looking at the countries of the global south and what it's capable of doing and what it has a right to do, you know. One of the things is when we look on different aspects, economically, you know, BRICS countries have already surpassed the G7 countries in terms of, you know, GDP per, you know,
per
actually,
capita.
yeah, exactly. But adjusted to PPP terms, which is a bit more accurate in terms of how we measure things. When we look at the global south countries versus the global north countries, it's the same trend. When we look at not just in economic brute terms, but also in terms of where the growth is happening, it's, you know, Europe is largely stagnating, you know, same with the US. It's happening largely in the global south, led by Asia. So these things are already happening. That is the motive force of history. This is, and whether or not I think a lot of the Western countries want to kind of wake up to that reality and work with that reality is one of the questions. I think the Brazil and China positioning themselves to help mediate these sort of geopolitical conflicts in the world is part of this, you know, motive, you know, change in history. This, you know, what you know, President Xi told to Putin, and one of the last visits that she went there was that this is changes unseen in a century, and our countries are pushing this history forward.
It's a little bit linked to the new era song, no?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a new era that is happening. How much violence, you know, the West wants to respond with is something I think we need to, you know, come to terms with, because what are the countries, we're trying to find a path to more peaceful development, and these are not just slogans. You know, these I think are the rights of our nations and our peoples to find an economic, political solution and development path, independent development path that works for our realities. That has been historically violently suppressed by the same countries now that don't want to come to terms with the fact that the world has changed.
Going back to your article about this long and strong Chinese-Brazilian relation, does it show that we are already in a multipolar and multilateral world?
I think it's emerging, you know, it's emerging. These are the examples that we are seeing already, you know, that there are sometimes I think the word multipolar can feel like these are kind of in competition, but we are definitely shifting from a world where there's a unipolarity that really was established after, you know, the collapsing of the Soviet Union till now, and that has changed on many fronts, and, you know, economic, political, and, you know, not military so far. So I think that is where we're heading, and I think that's the world we need to continue to support in the construction of. It's still very nascent.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you.
If you agree, it will be very nice if we can continue these talks in the future.
Sure.
To have your point of view of what's going on here in Brazil or in China or in the world, because it's also interesting to have. We want to have the voice of people who are in this new world that is coming.
Sure, you can count on me for future conversations. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Si vous avez aimé, vous pouvez liker, commenter. N'oubliez pas de poser des questions, surtout si notre interlocutrice revient. Ça sera très intéressant d'avoir vos questions à lui poser. Partagez la vidéo. On va vous mettre le lien de son article dont on a parlé juste en dessous de la vidéo, comme ça vous pourrez lire. Il est très long mais très intéressant. Vraiment, on ne peut pas l'aborder en une heure tellement c'est dense, mais ça vous donnera vraiment un aperçu très clair de la relation stratégique entre la Chine et le Brésil. Pour nous, le G20 se termine doucement. On se retrouve bientôt en France. Merci encore à tous ceux qui ont pu aider à la réalisation de ces reportages et de ces rencontres fantastiques. Et ceux qui ne l'ont pas encore fait, vous pouvez nous aider en cliquant sur le lien du pot commun que vous trouverez en dessous de cette vidéo. Donc à très bientôt à Paris et un grand salut de Rio de Janeiro.